What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We've got Regis Prograis, 25 wins, 1 loss, versus Ivan Redkach, 23 wins, 5 losses, 1 draw, and 1 no contest. This fight's taking place on April 17th, and it's going to be on that Jake Paul versus Ben Askren undercard. So, unlike Jake Paul versus Ben Askren, this fight includes 2 elite level boxers. And Regis Prograis is really trying to get his name back in the relevant mix after his loss versus Josh Taylor when he was fighting to unify the 140-pound titles. This was the finals of the World Boxing Super Series. Josh Taylor is now scheduled to fight Jose Ramirez, who has the other 2 belts. So Josh Taylor has the IBF and the WBA, whereas Jose Ramirez has the WBC and the WBO. And those are the belts that he unified in his fight versus Maurice Hooker, who we just saw lose to Virgil Ortiz Jr. up at 147. Down at 140, it was Jose Ramirez versus Maurice Hooker over here, and it was Josh Taylor versus Regis Prograis over here. And those were the 2 fights to see who's got 2 belts and then 2 belts. And now they're going to unify the 4. Taylor versus Ramirez. But that was a huge opportunity for Regis Prograis that he just came up a little short with. So now he's trying to, either recapture belts at 140 or eventually go up to 147, where you could go big game hunting for a Errol Spence, Terrence Crawford, Manny Pacquiao, and so forth. There are several challenges to be had at 147. Virgil Ortiz Jr., Jaron Boots Ennis. So Prograis had his comeback fight versus Juan Heraldez. He had it on PBC. So PBC controls most of the action, most of the fighters at 147. So it would probably make sense to go to 147 at some point if you plan to stay with PBC. Otherwise, if you wanted to stay at 140 for a while, you might want to get with Bob Arum and Top Rank, because that's where a lot of the 135 and 140 action is taking place. But Prograis' road to that light welterweight title, really started to catch some steam when he started winning the lesser NABF titles around 2016. He knocked out Julius Indongo in 2018. Indongo was the 4th guy who Terrence Crawford had knocked out to capture his 4th title. So to become undisputed 140-pound champ, Terrence Crawford's last victim was Julius Indongo. So in 2018, Prograis knocked him out in the 2nd round. Crawford had knocked him out in the 3rd round. And then a couple fights later, Prograis has a showdown versus Terry Flanagan in the World Boxing Super Series super lightweight quarterfinal. Now, Terry Flanagan was a longtime 135-pound WBO champ. So he was a lightweight champ for a couple years. A few defenses, successful title defenses, and then Flanagan goes up to 140 to challenge for the vacant WBO belt. That was one of the 4 that Crawford relinquished after capturing all 4. He dropped all 4 belts so then he could go up to 147 and compete there. So one of the belts left in Terrence Crawford's wake was that WBO belt that Flanagan challenged Maurice Hooker for. Hooker beat Flanagan in a close split decision fight, and now in the same World Boxing Super Series that Hooker also, entered and then, later lost to Jose Ramirez via 5th or 6th round TKO, Flanagan has to take on this, surging, not up-and-comer, but this guy who's really catching steam, Regis Prograis. That ends up being a fantastic fight where it was pretty even in some of the early to middle rounds. They were catching each other with counter shots, and they're both southpaws, which is another similarity to this fight. Both Prograis and Ivan Redkach are southpaws. Prograis and Flanagan both left-handed. And then Prograis drops Flanagan, hits him in the side of the to the side of the head with kind of an overhand left Flanagan hits the canvas, and a couple rounds later, Prograis blasts him again, knocks him into the ropes. That could have potentially been called another knockdown, but Prograis really came on strong in the second half of that fight, and that's what really kind of put him on the map to the wider boxing audience. That performance versus former champ Terry Flanagan in that WBSS quarterfinal. So the next round is an even greater showdown at 140. That was the semifinals, and that pitted Prograis versus Kiryl Relikh, who was surging himself. And a lot of people thought that this might have been up in the air. Prograis ends up dominating, exceeding all expectations, stops Relikh in the 6th round, and that was pretty much the high water mark to this point of Regis Prograis' career. And then his next fight was the close decision loss in the finals versus Josh Taylor for 2 of the 4 belts. Because in that Kiryl Relikh fight, that actually earned Regis Prograis the WBA light welterweight title, which he would then lose to Josh Taylor. So Ivan Redkach, who's trained by Jack Mosley, Shane Mosley and his dad, which I always thought was interesting. Shane Mosley's one of my favorite fighters of all time. Former 147-pound champ, former 135-pound champ, former 154-pound champ. He was basically the first person who got a legit decision win against Oscar De La Hoya. I didn't think that Felix Trinidad deserved a win over De La Hoya in that fight. Ike Corte, possibly, but that's another story. But yeah, the Mosleys trained Ivan Redkach. He, like I said, is another southpaw. He's a pretty hard hitter. He's just inconsistent as hell. Like between 2014 and let's say 2018, he was winning and losing about half and half. Like that's not a great pattern if you're becoming an elite boxer. So he lost versus Zenteklan. I always have trouble pronouncing that name, but it's the guy who got viciously knocked out by Mikey Garcia after Garcia's return after the multi-year layoff. But that guy actually knocked Ivan Redkach out in the 4th round. This was like in 2015. Redkach also lost via decision in 2016 versus Tevin Farmer, before Tevin Farmer won that belt and defended it a few times successfully, all on DAZN. So before Farmer wins that belt, he beats Ivan Redkach via decision. Redkach also fights John Molina Jr., who's been in there with several. He's been in there with Terrence Crawford. He's been in there with Josecito Lopez, Adrian Broner, Lucas Matisse. John Molina Jr.'s fought a lot of the top fighters in multiple weight classes, and he himself is kind of a win some, lose some guy. He fought a great fight and got the decision win versus Ruslan Provodnikov. That's one of John Molina Jr.'s biggest wins. And in 2017, Ivan Redkach fights John Molina Jr. Redkach hurts Molina Jr. so badly, like in the early rounds, like the 2nd or 3rd round. He's a pretty fast starter, and he's looking to get you out of there. He's throwing like these haymaker shots often. It's weird. It's inconsistent. Sometimes he does operate effectively behind his right jab. Other times he looks like he's just swinging for the fences and trying to take your head off. Well, he had Molina Jr. hurt in that fight, and then he lets Molina Jr. stand toe-to-toe with him and just kind of make it a phone booth style fight. Molina Jr. ends up decking him with a vicious shot. And Redkach hits the canvas. Ends up becoming an exciting brawl. But John Molina Jr. knocks Ivan Redkach out in the 4th round. That's probably Ivan Redkach's worst loss. But it really just speaks to his inconsistency. Now, to his credit, after that loss to John Molina Jr., he wins his next 3 fights, the 3rd of which is his biggest opportunity yet, versus former 2-division champ, 140 and 147, former champ Devin Alexander. So the first couple rounds are looking pretty competitive, pretty even. Devin Alexander is a volume guy. He likes to jump in there and throw 4 to 6 punches, try to get out. Alexander's worst loss up to this point was versus Amir Khan, and Amir Khan's never looked greater. That was one of Amir Khan's greatest performances against Devin Alexander. So Devin Alexander's really trying to get things back on track. He, just had a disappointing, I think, a draw versus Victor Ortiz, who's clearly past his prime. So, the writing's on the wall as far as Devin Alexander's career at this point. He also had like an opiate abuse issue that he was kind of recovering from. Just trying to really keep things on track. You just want to see these fighters like lives headed in the right direction. Well, this fight versus Ivan Redkach was Alexander's final fight. He gets stopped in the 6th round, TKO. That was a bit of a shocker. We've seen Alexander lose fights, but to see him get stopped in that fashion, it's like, yeah, you probably want to hang it up at that point. So that was Ivan Redkach's greatest moment, and then it led to his opportunity versus Danny Garcia, former, multi-division champ himself. Now, Garcia versus Redkach ended up being a pretty uneventful, it wasn't that good of a fight. It was somewhat competitive, and it did go the 12-round distance. Danny Garcia won that. So this is Ivan Redkach's first fight back. He actually got suspended for that fight for supposedly biting Danny Garcia. So this fight was about close to a year and a half ago. It was January 2020. This is Redkach's first fight back. Prograis' last fight was on Halloween of 2020. So he's had some recent action, and he knocked out Juan Heraldez in the 3rd round of that, comeback fight from the Josh Taylor loss, or lost to Josh Taylor. But yeah, Prograis got, a couple rounds in, got Heraldez, who was just clearly outmatched, got him out of there. So this is, his first serious opponent since losing that fight. And that's Prograis' only loss to date. Redkach has 5 losses on his record. But I expect Prograis to struggle a little bit in the early rounds. I expect it to be kind of competitive, but by the time we hit the 3rd, 4th, 5th round, I expect Prograis to be in control. This is still 140. Redkach has had his last few fights at 147. I question whether Redkach could even make weight at 140 effectively. When he fought Devin Alexander at 147, they both blew weight pretty badly. Like, I just question Redkach's overall discipline, focus, and again, consistency is key. So if he is in his absolute best shape, if he's given this training camp its all, is living the right lifestyle. I think he just got engaged. But at Redkach's best, I think he could give Prograis a quality few rounds of just kind of high octane activity. Throw a lot of punches at him, catch him with some of them. Prograis a pretty slick fighter. He's not Pernell Whitaker slick, but he does move his head, get out of the way of a lot of punches. You can see a lot of that in his fight versus Flanagan. But being a slick southpaw who also has a lot of power, in both hands. He's got fast punches, not Shane Mosley fast, but still impressively fast, where you see, the punches coming, whether he's throwing one at a time or a 2-3 punch combination, and it just looks impressive. And I think he's going to be able to kind of pot shot Redkach in a lot of these exchanges. Redkach, when he starts letting his hands go, drops a lot of his defensive responsibility. I'm surprised he didn't get caught at some point versus Danny Garcia with something really big. But he survived that fight, and that makes me think that this one's going to go the distance. But again, this one being down at 140 and not 147, I think it's going to be a bigger disadvantage for Redkach, who, again, let's see if he even makes the weight. This is a high-profile opportunity. This is on, a Jake Paul, undercard. So a lot of people who aren't even boxing fans are going to be seeing these guys. And so there's every incentive to want to prepare well for this. But again, I just can't rely on Redkach at this point. Whereas Prograis needs to look impressive because he views himself as a truly elite fighter and wants to get in there with some of the absolute best. He's already been in there in a very close fight with Josh Taylor, but I expect Prograis to have a little difficulty in the early rounds, get hit with a few shots from a fresh Ivan Redkach, but I expect him to really separate himself talent and skill-wise going into the 4th, 5th round and start to land super clean, flush shots, and then kind of get Redkach in a situation where he gets desperate, starts letting his hands go, and then maybe it's up to the corner to either throw the towel in, or you see, Redkach get finished with a, just a really nice combination, with his back against the ropes or something. But I do think that Prograis will close the show here. What happens after that is anybody's guess, because, it's kind of slim pickings at 140. Does he run it back with Josh Taylor if Taylor beats Ramirez? If Ramirez beats Taylor, do him and Prograis fight? Because Prograis is like the number 3 ranked guy after those two. So, anybody other than them, you're going to have to be taking a step back against like Jose Cepeda. I don't know, maybe if he looks impressive enough, he could try to lure Mikey Garcia, who's also kind of a 140, 147 tweener right now. But yeah, it's anybody's guess. But please, let me know your thoughts on Regis Prograis versus Ivan Redkach on the Jake Paul versus Ben Askren undercard. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.